Continuing with this slide here, the last item on the slide is something known as possessive individualism. Okay, now many of us may know what individualism refers to. It means the emphasis being placed on the individual over the larger collective, right? So this is what arises with the market revolution. So how does this work? Well, in agrarian times, let's say that family farm I just mentioned, there's a lot of children, right? And it's a very patriarchal household. Well, the emphasis was not on the individual whenever you had these agrarian societies. And this is likely true in most agrarian societies, even outside Western civilization. Let's say maybe in feudal Japan or China or, some societies that are even hunter-gatherer societies, right, in some parts of the world. They emphasize not the individual. They tend to emphasize the whole, right? The community where they live in, the village, right? Even the town, right? That's what's emphasized over the individualism. But what happens is, as you know, you see the demise of pure agrarianism. So with that, you see the demise of, this emphasis on the collectivity, right, or the larger whole. Rather, you see emphasis being shifted towards that of individualism, on the individual, excuse me. So with that, you're going to get this idea that it's the individual who should go out there, and especially when he or she comes of age, but emphasis on he because that's the gender norm back then, as we discussed with the separate spheres, right? Unless you were an immigrant family, by the way, both men and women worked. But, for the most part, the man was, responsible for going out there and achieving socioeconomic mobility, climbing up the ladder, right? Picking yourself up by the bootstraps, right? And just doing your best to climb up the ladder again. So if this is really the prevalent ideology that becomes accepted by everyone, and notice that's not what was thought about, right? If you lived in a household farm, right? Or excuse me, a small family farm, right? You didn't think about moving up in the world, right? You knew your role was predetermined upon birth to work as a peasant, right? On the same farm, maybe the same land at least. Okay, but now you live in a different kind of society. It's commercial. You have to think about moving up the ladder because that's the way that the ideology operates, and hence you think about the individual rather than the larger collective. Right? So now possessive is even tossed in there. By the way, that term possessive individualism, that wasn't created until much later in the 20th century. Okay, so they didn't know this term back then. This is kind of applied in hindsight, in history, that is. But possessive individualism, possessive means you own yourself. Okay, you are your own person, right? You're not a slave. And this is going to fit neatly with Jacksonian politics, which we're about to discuss. Okay, so you own yourself, and possessive individualism proclaim the idea that, you own yourself, you depend upon no one but yourself, right? So that's the idea that became prevalent, that Americans should depend upon no one but themselves. It's all about you. Okay, now notice that if everyone subscribes to this belief and ideology, that's going to do wonders for the economic system as a whole, because everyone's going to be working so hard just because they believe in it, that it's going to contribute to the vitality and the dynamism of that economy, right? So it's kind of neat here to see how ideology and economics kind of fit together, right, at this historical period. So now we're moving on to the second phase of our discussion of Jacksonian democracy, and that's the political dimension. And this is called Jacksonian democracy, also known as Jacksonian freedom. And what happens, as noted in the slide, you get this notion of citizenship in this republic as redefined. Okay. And it's going to lead to something called mass democracy. Okay. Now you got to remember this, that in world history, perhaps Athens, Greece, and ancient Greece aside, but even that was a small sort of urban setting compared to what we're talking about in the 1800s, let alone today, right? This really hadn't happened before, this mass democracy. So it is truly revolutionary in that sense. Okay, I should mention this, that it has the name Jackson because the president at that time, but Jackson really never passed a law or, if you will, an executive order, right, saying from now on all poor people could vote, all poor males, that is, could vote. Okay, it's more like this, that Jackson embodied the spirit of the age. Okay, first of all, he wasn't from the elite class. Compared to the previous presidents, he was kind of humble in his origins. Okay, he was actually an ethnic minority, Scots-Irish, okay, not Anglo. And he was a different type of politician. He's more of a frontiersman rather than your elite again, from Virginia or from, Boston. So he's a different type. But he claimed to be the symbol of your common person. So therefore, when you think about the common person here, right, that's what you're emphasizing with Jacksonian democracy, the common person. So just to repeat what Jacksonian democracy refers to and why it's so revolutionary in our country, well, what this is eliminating the property qualifications for voting. In other words, before Jacksonian democracy, and you should know this from previous lectures, previous topics, well, if you had suffrage, or let's put it this way, a condition for suffrage, meaning, the right to vote, was that you had to own land, you had to own property. So there's a direct connection with property ownership and citizenship here, because a citizen really in a democracy means you could participate in democracy, namely through voting. Okay, so obviously if you eliminate property qualifications as a condition for voting, then you're redefining what it is to be a citizen in this republic, and hence it is truly a redefinition of Republican citizenship. Now, I want to emphasize this. It's very important to note that there's a linkage between Jacksonian democracy and the market revolution. Okay, that is to say, economics and politics. And what is this? What's the link? Well, as we noted, once we leave pure agrarianism behind and, begin the nascent stages of industrialization, or amid this market revolution, you see the demise of small family farms again. Well, land ownership becomes much less important. And that should be obvious, right? If agrarianism ends, then, well, land ownership becomes less crucial to your survival, right? Why? Because the market will supply you with the food that you eat, not the land that you grow crops on, right? In fact, today, think about this, most of us who are listening to this are not farmers, right? In fact, we don't base land as the index of our wealth, do we? No, we base it on our salaries and wages, our bank account, right? Whatever the figure is. So it's the case now that land ownership is no longer a determinant for suffrage, right? And it makes sense if you think about agrarianism being left behind, because again, land is no longer the most important or crucial index of one's economic status, right? Okay, so that's Jacksonian freedom, or Jacksonian democracy again, granting the right to vote for all men again, regardless of whether you own property or not, and that's called synonymously universal male suffrage, right? And also called mass democracy because, again, this is on such a mass scale compared to others. Now, I just mentioned in previous times, let's say in Greece, in the Roman Empire, or not Empire, but Roman Republic, sure there was some form of democracy there, but democracy was also a controversial idea in political philosophy because going back to Aristotle and Plato, right, the ancient Greek philosophers, they felt that democracy was one of the worst ways you could organize a state or a government because you can't really trust the average person to do the right thing. Okay, in fact, Plato is well known for privileging the philosopher as the proper statesperson, right? The philosopher king, so to speak, right? The best persons who should rule, he believed, were philosophers like himself, right? Yeah, there was a lot of skepticism surrounding democracy, and that was the case through most of Western history and Western philosophy until this time we have with the Enlightenment, which we talked about, right? The Enlightenment questioned monarchy, at the same time began to legitimize democracy, right? So we have in operation this Jacksonian freedom, right? That's now granting the right to vote for men, regardless of property ownership. But one belief that hung over many of the leaders and the elite in our country was the belief in the possibility of, quote, the tyranny of the majority. Okay, when you think about this term, the tyranny of the majority, well, first of all, tyranny. If you're familiar with tyranny, well, in fact, we discuss it with the Declaration of Independence, right? Tyranny is usually thought of in association with a king or an emperor, right? A tyrant, like a single person who possesses power and wields it upon his subjects or her subjects, right? If it's a queen, well, and if it's done unjustly. Well, what about people though? Can they be tyrants? Right. So that's the idea of tyranny of the majority, the belief that the majority, the public at large, could be just as tyrannical as that emperor or the king or queen who is a tyrant, and they're ruling unjustly and unwisely, and possibly leading to the ruination of their society. So this was a prevalent belief that needed to be overcome at this time of Jacksonian democracy. Okay,